welcome to episode 19 of the International Web Effectiveness Podcast, where Bill Hunt and I, Bill Scully, focus on the strategies and techniques necessary to improve your web presence and manage your global websites. In our last episode, we asked the question, what if Hreflang were to go away? And focused on three levels of activity, from must-haves to more dramatic actions, such as moving to language only with dynamic personalization. There's a lot of interesting conversations in that one, so check it out. That's episode 18. In this episode, we assume Hreflang is not sunset, and what you can do if you've perfectly executed your Hreflang implementation, but it's not working as intended. But before we do that, I want to talk about the video from Mark Williams-Cook, where he revealed an exploit he found to learn how Google classifies queries and websites. I don't remember exactly how I found this. It was a YouTube video, but man, he dropped some bombs in there. How you doing, Bill?
I'm good. And you?
Good. So I shared that with you, and you said, yeah, you also saw it as well. So I guess it's getting around. What do you think?
Yeah, there was a Search Engine Land article, and then I think he actually presented this at Search Norwich, a conference.
Yeah, that's what I saw. Search Norwich.
Yeah.
Cool. So you see anything jump out here that is something that you wouldn't have thought of?
Yeah, I mean, it validates some things we've talked about. I think the one thing that he found was these query classifications. So for those that don't know what we're talking about and haven't seen it yet, he basically found an endpoint, and it's a place where Google essentially talks to other systems. And what they did is he found that they're using a bunch of, sort of shortened code bits to abbreviate large scale tasks. And one of them that was in there was these query classifications. And it basically, what he determined, and I forget how many things they looked at once they found this exploit. He obviously didn't tell anybody. They wanted to figure out what they can do with it before. And then they found that Google breaks these down into, I think he said, 8 refined query semantic classes. So things like short facts, Boolean, which were literally yes or no questions, instructions, definition, reasons, comparison, consequence, and these were things that were directly related to your money or your life. One of them in here, I thought these were interesting because this answers a lot when we're starting to talk about when somebody does a query. We've seen a lot of chatter about intent. When somebody did the query, what did they get? And then, anybody that's been making their fortune off presenting things like what time is it in Mumbai, India, or, what's the average shoe size of people in Finland? Those I think can be disintermediated by Google simply answering the question. One of the things that he talked about in that took a fair bit of time was this piece called consensus scoring. And what he found was that when Google was going to present something, they were trying to remain neutral or a general consensus. And so what that was is they looked at, all the passages or the majority of the entries that they found related to that answer. And then basically, okay, what did the majority of them say? So the exact example he gave is the earth flat? So somebody asking that question is, asking. And was a very interesting way he interpreted this was around, are they debunking queries? So is the earth flat? Is whatever crazy conspiracy theory or crazy question you have, they try to decide with consensus. So the majority of the people results that had this would skew that way. So it was interesting too. One of his interpretations of this was if you're contrarian to the consensus. So if you're a flat earther, then you may not rank as high, not because Google is necessarily, trying to, convert people into round earth people. It's just that the consensus were indicating that that was a contrarian view. So they may take one or two that are well articulated, well researched. But if you're just, Joe Bob and you've got the local blog saying, yeah, the earth is flat and, because I can't see the curvature, then you're probably not going to rank for that. So I thought that was really interesting. And, he goes on to compare it to, there's a really good discussion in the video about, this weighting around why your money or your life and how that ties into consequence. I thought that was pretty good. The other big one for me, which we've already talked about a little bit previously, was about site quality score. And one he dove into a little bit more was predicting. Now, what was really interesting about his thesis was he tried to sort of wrap this in the umbrella of why did so much crap start ranking in like 2022? And what he deduced is that this probability of ranking score and he talked about Google's patent for it, was giving sites this sort of probable rank score. And based on that, because things looked legit, they looked complete, and it wasn't until they got some data, and this is where they reintroduced this idea of click data. So he tried to basically not throw Google under the bus, since like everybody else, they lied. They do use click data. He did say that probably when a site comes on board, there is no click data. Therefore, you can't use click data. But once a site has been indexed and has been shown, you can start to apply real click data within the pool of click data for that topic to decide if it would. I thought those were really interesting, this idea of a site score. And this is why what we see on an Hreflang and international level, because if you launch a net new site, and especially if it's in the same language, you might be getting sort of tripped up in the duplicate clustering, which we're going to talk about in a future episode. And the other site, because it's viewed site wide as being better, maybe why it shows up. So I thought those were really good, things that I took out of it.
Yeah, I've been talking about consensus for a while now. Google doesn't know the answers, right? So what do they know to rank? So that somehow they need to figure out what the main consensus is, and this just proves that they're using that. Also, that site-wide score, classification, I think is there. And when you talk about having the click data, and like we always say, you gotta think like a lawyer when Google says something. They're probably not using your click data, but they're aggregating that click data, comparing it to the types of pages, and then they could put together a prediction model, and they're using that for the rankings.
Yep. And one other thing that you'll like, because you talked about this came out of your San Diego, your Brighton SEO San Diego thing, is the idea of brand and brand searches. So he sort of was talking about that if you're a well-known brand and you're getting searched, then Google's going to put a lot more clout and trust against an established brand as opposed to a lesser known brand. And it's actually, I just had a really great conversation with my good friend, Vivek Bhagarva, who has a really cool lookalike audience mapping tool. And we were talking about this and really thinking about, can somebody potentially use lookalike audiences to get in front of people that have familiarity with another brand, because you're sort of, figuring out where they live and where they look for things online, and sort of, I guess it's the sort of search equivalent of dropping into their DMs. You can get in front of them. And I thought that was that, he didn't say that. It's just, again, brand keeps coming up. We've heard this like a dozen times in the past 2 weeks on the volume of brand searches. And I'm not quite there yet. I do agree completely that, if people are familiar with a brand, Google's more than likely going to rank a brand over somebody unknown. And that's why, somebody that comes live and has no social visibility is nearly impossible in today's age to launch a company, launch in a new market, launch a site without any social media chatter. It just almost cannot happen. It's possible, but it's not probable. And I think all these things are starting to tie together. I think that's what's interesting, is we need to think about things a little more multidimensional than, as you and I do. But I think other people really need to do that. One other thing that he said, which is something we've been talking about, a lot is he gave 3 criteria for any ranking factor. So before you go out and take anything you hear, even what he's saying, and start, putting in change requests and doing all kinds of crazy stuff, and I thought this was really interesting how he laid this out. This is his sort of sniff test, if you will. One, does it make sense?
Yeah.
If you hear this, okay, does Google use consensus? And, okay, that's probable, right? Because they don't know the answer. They're only showing what they think makes sense. And if they've got, wonder if it's 70% of the people are answering one way, plus or minus, and then the rest another, then, okay, then the larger volume of answers, for sort of answer A is probably going to win. So that goes back to consensus. So that's probable. 2, does it scale? Google just doesn't do this for one website. They do it for the entire universe of websites. So that's another interesting one. There's nobody, necessarily pulling individual levers and that other than, the spam penalties. And then the third, is there any other evidence? Is there a patent from Google or somebody saying that they do this type stuff? Has Google given statements? And then another one, he said, has there been a big data study? Is it something that, and I'm not even going to name names, but, the usual suspects, the people that are crawling the web and producing these big data type studies, we looked at, 20 million websites or 50 million websites, and this is what we deduced. I think those were really real good sniff tests that people can apply when they start to hear some of these things.
Yeah. It was really well done. The presentation that I watched was really well done, factual, with some theory in there of his own, but I don't think there was a single thing in that I disagreed with, and something that I'm going to spend more time thinking about specifically. So he had mentioned there was a threshold to be eligible for search features, and there was actually some scale for that.
Yeah, that was interesting. He actually extracted it from their weighting, I believe. And then, then this is the number, right? Wasn't it? I mean, it was a lot of sites that they scored. And then, in the presentation, he has that chart, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah. If you haven't seen it, you definitely need to watch. So let's transition to what we want to talk about today. Why is your perfect Hreflang not working? If you've been listening to us for a while, you don't need this, but if you're listening for the first time, we define the purpose of Hreflang to explicitly state a specific website's language or language region. It's not a ranking factor, but rather a tool to swap URLs and search results based on a user's locale or language. So you've done the work. All of the signals that are associated with Hreflang are in place and done correctly, but it's just not working for you. So, Bill, why don't you lead us through some of these things? Why is your perfect Hreflang not working?
Okay. Yeah, I actually wrote an article on this, and it talks about my experience with about a dozen companies. So I gave my presentation at PubCon, and then a bunch of companies, they basically said, hey, we perfectly implemented our Hreflang. And of those dozen, 10 actually were implemented correctly, 2 were not. So we can kick them out of our sample size. And in trying to answer these people, a couple were people that hired us to do Hreflang audits to really figure out why aren't they working? Because again, they thought everything was working well. And what I deduced was, as I went through these 12 sites, one of them was Google hasn't seen the Hreflang tags. So this is an interesting thing. And I'm going to bring up the article so I got the actual data. So in one of these examples, it was a new English language market site that had launched 30 days prior to them putting in their Hreflang tag. So those that have heard us before know that, and especially anybody that knows Hreflang, Google has to go to each page and verify that unless you're using Hreflang. So in this case, they put them in the tags. They put them in 30 days after the site had already launched. So that meant most of these pages had already been, if they were indexed, were probably flagged as being duplicate because there was nothing to indicate that they had a purpose. And what we found was 60% of the URLs in this one case of this new site that was launched were flagged as duplicate, with Google picking an existing, or really their US site, as the preferred page. Now, when I ran Screaming Frog and I connected to their search console, when I pulled back that, essentially the duplicate canonical report, it also says, when did Google look at that? And what I saw is that 386 of the page, so a little more than half, let's just say 2/3 of the pages, Google hasn't visited yet. And then now it's been 31 to 60 days. So they visited it prior to Hreflang going live, but they haven't visited since it went live. And then there was about 90 pages that hadn't been visited in the last 90 days. So if Google hasn't visited, then they don't know about the canonical relationship. Right? Because that's one of the big challenges with tags. Maybe they came to the US English site, they find the tag, it's basically got a queue, and it is given a priority task to go fetch those pages. But until they do, but you're going to, the first thing they said was, Bill, there was about 200 pages that had been visited. They used my own data against me because I built a neat little chart. And I'm like, okay, great. You're right. I saw the same thing. And then when I dug in, what I found is that Google, of those pages, we had another variation of this, is that Google couldn't see the tags because of JavaScripts. In this one example, they had 33 scripts that were either in the head or being inserted through a tag manager scenario. And I think, 8 of the scripts had some malformation. They didn't close the script, or they had some defect. And Google's told us, and a variety of people have tested this. And actually in our Hreflang error course, we link to some of those sources that show that if you have defects in your JavaScripts, Google will skip over everything in the head and basically go into the body. So it was totally not indexing any of their Hreflang. So it was really, in one case, they hadn't seen it because they had a bunch of other errors. In the other case, they hadn't been picking it up because they weren't able to read the Hreflang in the head. So what these guys did to solve this is they actually took a sampling of 10 pages because, developers know everything, and they didn't believe me. So they said, fine, we'll take 10 pages, we'll do the pairing, we'll load them. And magically, the Hreflang worked because the pages A were indexed and B got rid of a cannibalization problem. So that's when they realized, oh yeah, we better fix these scripts. It was the textbook answer. Google should be able to figure this out. Clearly they don't, can't, or won't.
Whose textbook? Google shouldn't have to figure anything out.
Yeah, exactly. Whose textbook?
I blame a lot of the problems on Google trying to figure stuff out, and people just expect Google to fix it.
Preach, brother, because, if anybody that's taken that error course, know that that's like one of the first thing I talk about is please stop giving exceptions to stuff. If you say it's got to be this way, then enforce it. Because if you even mention in public, like reciprocation, they're like, yeah, well, you don't really need reciprocation because most people use a system that puts reciprocation. And if you don't happen to have it, then, well, we can probably figure it out. Well, no, it's self-referencing, not reciprocation. You must have reciprocation. And there's 3 or 4 others. Like they're like, well, we can sort of figure out if you use relative URLs. By definition, relative URLs break the whole syntax because a HTTP version of a page is not an alternate equivalent of an HTTPS. So again, we can rant about that nonsense all day long. But yes,
trailing slash.
Whose textbook?
Well,
trailing slashes, they're different URLs. So, we could do a whole, rants and raves on just that. But at the end of the day, it worked when we presented the pair. in a format that was readable. And so all I said was, please just take all the SEO bits, title tag, canonical tag, meta description tag, hreflang tags, and move that directly after the open head tag. And it's not going to negatively impact your scripts. And it's going to make sure, especially when you're on a heavy JavaScript site, that stuff is fetched on the first load of the page and you're not even waiting for render. All right, number 2 that I found was, and this is something that I don't think a lot of people are paying attention to, is IP detection blocking Google. So in this one case, when we unpacked it, what we realized was, because when we looked at their sitemaps and their own XML sitemaps were giving an error that said Google can't read it. And so what was happening is when Google was coming to the sitemaps, and this was a case where they did XML sitemaps, Google couldn't read it because they were getting denied access, because they looked at the bot as fetching the XML sitemap as a bot and wouldn't let them. In another case, we found that when Google was trying to go verify, Google from the US was trying to verify the UK or the Ireland pages as being, valid alternatives with the reciprocation back to the US, they were being sent back to the US because IP detection would say, Google, you're from the US. You must look at our US page. And so what they ended up doing was basically working with their CDN provider to put an exemption in to allow Google to fetch whatever page or whatever search engine, legit search engine, fetch the page that they wanted. And this crackdown actually came because they got a ticket to say, hey, we got to stop bot traffic. And so Google is a bot, Bing is a bot. So they got caught up in this denial. And then they were also, in the IP, both detecting because they're a bot, but in this other case, they were getting caught because they were going to a market other than what they represented. The third issue that we encountered, remember, this is out of a sample of 12. These were 10 people that literally had they didn't have any errors of all the, I think, 27 errors that are common with Hreflang. The other thing we noted was there was little to no identical content or non-local content. I'm looking at my paraphrased notes and I can't even understand what I wrote. But these were 100% duplicate. There was nothing to say that this France-French page was any different than the Canadian-French page. There was nothing to say this is France or this is Canada. In one case, they didn't have currency that was readable. They weren't using schema tags to indicate, they had nothing to indicate they were any different. One of these cases was what we call, which was the second part of this, aspirational hreflang, which, let me finish this first one. So in our next podcast, we're actually going to talk about Google's most recent search off the record about duplicate content. This one will make more sense during that, where Google is taking every page that looks similar to another, and they put it into a cluster. And then once it's in the cluster, this is where the next step is for them to pick, of all the pages that look the same, that are exact or nearly exact or highly similar, which one of these should we present to people? Now, at this stage, when they're doing this, they have not seen hreflang. And when we talk about this handling in the next podcast, this will make a little more sense. So I'm going to go into the details of it then. But basically, Google thought these pages were true duplicates and were basically saying, nope, I don't believe it. And what it took was a couple steps, and this was a problem in all the cases where we had this, was that the new site or the refreshed content had launched before they deployed the updated hreflang. So hreflang, in the case of the new market, meaning they launched in a new market, hreflang was an afterthought. And they said, oh, yeah, we should have an hreflang because, all of our pages are viewed as duplicate. In the other case, they updated the content, they did all the redirects, and nobody thought to update the hreflang to reflect the new alternate pairing and the new URLs. So when you're doing a migration or a launch, it's absolutely critical to make sure you have Hreflang dialed in, because as Gary said on the International Search Off the Record episode, that Hreflang does trigger a crawl dependency for Google's crawler to go. It's sort of a priority dependency to go fetch them.
Yeah, and in that duplication podcast, it was interesting to hear that once you're clustered, it could be hard to get out of that cluster. So, like, how would you re-trigger a new crawl if you've already been clustered as a duplicate?
Exactly. Some other signal, and then, then Google actually gave a number of about how many signals that they use to determine the canonical, with some being more important than others. We're going to use 40. That as a teaser to get you to come to the next episode.
40, right? Didn't he say it depends on the day?
Come on. We wanted them to tune in.
Well, we'll talk about...
Yeah, it's 40.
We'll talk about 41 of them next time.
Yeah, there we go. The next one was aspirational hreflang. This is really simple. What they did is they had incorrectly... So, I call it aspirational versus you lied, because there's a couple variations of this. So people may, you may have a launch date and management said you must launch on this day, and the site is what it is. So you launch, or you do a soft launch, and 60% is localized and 40% is not. But because you're doing a system-wide hreflang, especially with tags, you can't pick and choose. And so all of those, and then we link to, in the show notes, we'll put this, but in the article, I linked to an article that shows an example of this where they launched in Greece and Croatia, and I think it was 8 markets. And the pages were all in Greek. They said they were in Greek by the hreflang, but they were actually in English. And we caught that because we were trying to figure out why were all the Greek pages that should have been in Greek language, did Google pick a US English page as the canonical? And I'm like, oh, this is brilliant. We've got our first case of mum, where Google is picking the best page in the world. And it turned out when we looked at them, they were in English. And so it was just simply penalizing you because they were in English. They weren't in Greek. So we don't know if they penalized you because you gave an incorrect language statement, because Google can detect language. My guess is these are actually in English. They don't serve a particular purpose because there's nothing unique on them. Therefore, we're going to just, again, put them in the cluster, and there's no signal to move them out.
It would be
really go ahead.
It would be really interesting to see if you could go back and actually tag those properly. So
we did.
Oh, great.
So in the aspirational article, I talk about that we actually did go back. So it turned out they're an hreflang builder client. And so once they came to us, and an agency was managing their hreflang using hreflang builder. So when they came back to us, they actually told us, and what we did is we went in and we changed the language for the entire, all the Greek pages, because they were all still in English. They hadn't been localized. And so by doing that, we were then able to, Google started indexing, but it was very slow. It took about 4 months to get, I think, the majority of them indexed. But now, because we declared they were English for Greece and Croatia, Google started indexing them. So it just basically showed that, and again, I politely say aspirational. Now, the second part of this is you've deployed early and you still have pages that aren't. How we've recommended people do that is crawl them and find those pages. And then again, this is hard if you're using tags, because tag is going to tag everything. You'd have to write some logic that these pages, because interestingly enough, they're using, like one case we had was they were saying it's French France, but they were in English. So the language tag was saying French French, so you couldn't use that as a signal. In the end, what they did was they dropped their hreflang tags completely for that market. And then what we did, well, for every market, and then those pages that hadn't been localized, we were able to load them separately in hreflang builder to say these were English France. And then as they started, there's not an automated way, but there is a ticket that the new owners of Hreflang Builder have to build that functionality that, as we detect the page coming in, the language has changed because we can flag it as being English with a potential to be localized. Then they can update it at that point. So that's a pretty cool feature. I don't know what the ETA for that is, but this is a big problem for people that are launching sites before they're completely localized.
I want to remind people of our free Facebook group where we use that as an opportunity to discuss these things, and you can ask any questions you want. You can also suggest ideas for upcoming podcasts. You can find that by searching International Web Mastery Free Group.
The next one I found, this was the first time I've ever seen this. And in the article, I actually have pictures using Ryan Jones, was it SERP Ninja, his tool? God, he's going to kill me for not remembering the name of it.
I'll look it up.
Is it SERP? Hold on, I have a link. SERPrecon.com. This episode is brought to you by Ryan Jones and SERPrecon.com. So the invoice is in the mail, Ryan. And so, because again, Hreflang was perfect. There was not a duplicate. Google, both pages were indexed. And I'm like, why? How is Google and why is Google taking this Canadian page and showing it in the US? It made no sense. And so I was doing a demo test with Ryan's tool, and I put both sites in, both pages. And what was interesting is the Canadian page. So the phrase I used, I don't want to out the brand. So their phrase, it was a branded query. It was their brand plus the product. And what was interesting is his tool determined that that was a commercial query with commercial intent. And the Canadian page, the non-local page that was showing up in the US, its overall intent of that page was commercial. So the search query intent was commercial. The page's intent was commercial. The US page, because of all the legalese and all the marketing copy that they had in there, was deemed to be navigational.
Wow.
And that was really interesting. And then when I fed that back, the brand's like, yeah, well, we got to have that. That's non-negotiable. And it's like, well, I know Canada is a different market and they're not as, they don't have as many requirements as we do, but what can you do? And it actually, fostered a pretty interesting discussion is how can we have that, all that informational or navigational information in there? And again, we didn't have the same replication when we put in non-branded queries. Like when we put in, now if we had a buy intent, like they don't sell it directly, so we couldn't put where to buy. But it was some things that indicated, more commercial that we knew we had content on and other pages. Those all showed up fine. So it was just this homepage. And so, we came up with a variety of ideas on how to potentially adjust the content, demote some content, amplify some other content to give it more of a commercial intent. So that was a pretty interesting thing and I've seen two cases of this now that I've been using his tool and really looking at the intent when we have the wrong market, same language, wrong market ranking, just to make sure that they have the same searcher intent.
I would have never thought of that. So that's pretty cool tool.
I wouldn't until I saw the data.
Yeah.
And again, I got to give Ryan all the credit when because and if you look at the article, I have his results screen side by side. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is interesting. And with all the chatter about intent, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Again, we get into the deal breaker, right? If I got to show A or B, now that gets to the next one, the one that we have, which we wrote this article about a while ago. Ironically, same company that I was just talking about. Maybe not the same company, because I do use their name of their product in there. But what was interesting, and in the article I talk about this, so the query they were using to detect cannibalization problems, they were using the US queries. And one of the US queries was they were looking for a product name plus active ingredients, because that's how people search for it in the US, because we're trained to understand active ingredients. In Australia, their product page they don't have to break out active or inactive ingredients in Australia. So they only say ingredients. Now, what's Google? If Google has two pages, an Australian page that doesn't use the word active or the context of active ingredients, and then the US page that does, when we're checking a query using an Australian IP, hopefully I didn't lose anybody on that breadcrumb trail. Google's going to show the US page because for that query, it was the best page.
Yeah.
And so, a way to cheat was they just simply went in and for their Australia test, took out active ingredient and just said put product name plus ingredients, because that's a fair query in Australia. That's a relevant query in Australia. And I think this surfaces a problem that we've talked about with cannibalization, where a lot of times your rank report that you're using as a proxy for cannibalization may be using phrases that are only germane or relevant to a market and not, especially around product names. We're seeing some skewing even on things when people have a product name with a TM or a registered trademark symbol butted against the name of the product, because that creates a new phrase as opposed to a different. It's a quirky thing. We've never been able to give Google to give us an answer is, does a trademark symbol, the ASCII characters, butted up against a phrase, does it negatively impact what you present? But anyways, this was, these two go hand in hand. And then we've been seeing this a lot. The third piece of this trifecta of relevance of query has been around brand names. So we've talked about this in the past where, a company like IBM that uses IBM.com, you technically can never get to IBM.com, that page, because there's a 302 redirect on an IP detection that will route you to the appropriate market. There is no use case within their IP language or IP location detection where you would ever resolve to IBM.com. It's always going to be a country or a language version of their site. But because IBM.com has like 50 gajillion URLs linking to it, for a query like IBM, it could be the most relevant. And we've solved this in about 20 cases by simply adding like IBM.com or NewBalance.com or ASICS.com to Hreflang and making IBM.com an X default, because making it like an English page or making it an X default, that's the recommendation we give, because Google is going to present that and then the IP detection will switch over. What this allowed, just before people get spun up about this, what it's going to do is any market that we have a website, it's going to allow the IBM or your company local market homepage show up, as opposed to the more highly native IBM.com or yourcompany.com page. So because there's really it could show up in Tonga, let's say, because they don't have a Tongan website. But if that happens, then the IP, when they click on it, the IP detection is going to take them elsewhere. Nobody's tracking rankings or anything like that in Tonga for them. So it's sort of no harm, no foul. But it does solve the problem of the global homepage showing up in these other markets. So those are all the reasons. I think there was like 9 of them that we wrote about, which were all reasons to explain why, use whatever Hreflang testing tool, use whatever guru you want to use. If everything comes back that it's perfect, and I've only seen a few that have actually been done site-wide perfectly, it's probably one of these other reasons. And some of them, we've given you ways to solve it. There's some, like if the intent is out of whack, well, make it more aligned to the intent. But yeah, if you can detect that it's one of these problems, then use the recommendation we've given you and we've talked about today as a way to solve it. Anything to add to that, Bill? Anything from your experience that
I have a couple questions.
think we didn't touch on?
Yes, yeah. I have a couple questions. Going back to the root domain as the X default. So just to be clear, you're saying if you have this situation, you would use .com as the X default, and you would have all of the regional home pages as the alternates, and vice versa.
Right. Whether they're
Yeah, okay.
CCTLDs or
Yeah.
they're a folder,
Okay.
country language, those would all be the alternate of that because they are the alternate. Now, this is the problem is that because now we're going to, now this, let me also put this clarification in. This will only work if you're using a XML sitemap.
That was my second point. You couldn't
Because,
put the tag.
yeah, that page is not indexed because it's a 302 redirect.
Right.
Google will never load that page. But remember, a 302 redirect, Google keeps it and keeps all the equity because by virtue of a 302, you're expecting it to come back.
Yeah.
And so that's why we need to do this. So what we have people do that often with that are using tags and like tags and their system does tags beautifully is they will take all their home pages and put them in an Hreflang XML just to make this work. And in the, like I said, 20 or 22 versions that we've done this explicitly for people, in every case, this root homepage is probably the best way to describe it, has been removed as the ranking page for company name in those markets where there is a legitimate market specific website.
Yep.
And then we'll link to that article where I go through that process because it's pretty clear. I tried to cover all the nuances and Bill, what if questions for people.
Right. So to wrap up, a couple things. Google's got to find the tag. So if your pages are already considered duplicate, you got to figure out how to break that out of that grouping. I haven't seen this before. I mean, it's obvious, but I don't think people are talking about this. You definitely want to implement Hreflang before you launch, especially if you have like a new region. Like imagine having a site that works well regionally. Now you bolt on a new region, but you don't include it in the Hreflang yet. That is considered another page. That page gets considered amongst all your other pages. That probably gets flagged as a duplicate.
Yep.
And I think the third one for me is, and it's obvious again, but not a lot of people talking about it. Like if you're saying with your Hreflang tag that a page is French, but it's really in English, you're basically lying. And, why would Google want to consider that a French page? Plus, tell me if I'm wrong here, I believe that Google is first really looking at language anyway, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And then they're trying to figure out, and then as another teaser for our next episode, Alan from the Dupes team actually talks about this where they are looking at what version of a same language page to show people based on their location. So it is a good thing. And then the one thing I just want to make sure we put it out there again, when you're doing a launch or a refresh and you materially change the content, make sure Hreflang is updated because remember, as Gary said, it does trigger a crawl event, to where Google will go fetch that. So it may help. And we've seen it when we've launched Hreflang simultaneous to a new market launch. When we've had that at launch, even if you're doing a soft launch, the pages get indexed exponentially more than if we didn't have it. And so make sure you add that to your site migration or site refresh to-do checklist.
Okay, great. Well, we hope you're finding value in our conversations. If you're enjoying the show, we'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to rate and review the podcast on your favorite platform. We also want to hear from you. Feedback motivates us. It helps us plan future episodes. So follow International Web Mastery on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. And let's talk. Thanks, Bill.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, this is Bill Scully. I just wanted to let you know that we have a free training course called Demystifying Hreflang. It includes 6 modules and is over an hour long with a quiz at the end of each module. You can find it at internationalwebmastery.com. Hope to see you there.